Hello, today I'm reviewing this chunk of sand called the Skypad 2.0 XL. This is easily the best speed pad available right now on the current market. Objectively, nothing else comes close to matching its quality. I also just think that it's the highest performance mouse surface available, period. My raw aim and mouse control is better on this than anything I've ever used, and I also think that it will be the same for you. However, despite my performance, this pad is still not my main. I think there are a few very major issues with this pad that hold it back from taking my number one spot. So today I want to help you guys understand both what makes this pad so good and what I find to be the shortcomings that prevent it from reaching greatness and overall claiming my top spot. Alright, let's get into it. So the very first thing that you notice about the Skypad is that the quality of this glass is crazy good. It is thick, very heavy, and feels completely solid. I cannot overstate how heavy this feels, especially for a mouse pad. This thing is beefy and feels extremely premium because of it. The surface of the glass is also frosted. This makes it slightly textured and not smooth like you would find on most window glass. The texture itself consists of very tiny bumps that are extremely close together on the surface. These minuscule bumps feel very nice in your arm when you're moving across the pad. On your skin, it almost feels soft in a very weird way. When you're ramming your nails or any other solid surface against it, of course it's going to feel very hard. But to the soft skin on the underside of my arm, it almost reminds me of a fabric texture. It's almost like the tiny bumps on the surface mimic a very fine textile texture when you start to rub it against your skin. Therefore, I don't think any people with sensitivity issues with very rough pads will have any sort of problem with the Skypad. It is quite pleasant to the touch. The glass also stays cool to the touch, which just feels very nice to me. The logo print and color you see are also printed on the underside of the glass, so they don't affect the surface whatsoever. The only thing you're feeling is this raw, frosted glass. This feeling of unmistakable quality on the surface is really what helps sets it apart from normal window glass. Very specific and deliberate care was taken into making this an actual mouse surface that was meant for use. You can't simply take a cutting board or any other run-of-the-mill glass surface and mimic this feeling of quality. A surface that feels this good during normal use can only ever be special made for that purpose. This pad is extremely unique and has no real substitutes outside of other surfaces specially designed for gaming. This glass itself is also tempered, which makes it extremely durable. Drop tests have shown that this pad can take an absolute beating before it will break. It'll damage the concrete you drop it on before the pad itself. You should have absolutely no concerns with this ever breaking down or damaging during normal use. You will only harm this pad if you tried, and even then it's still going to take a considerable amount of effort. It also comes in an amazing box, so even the most neglectful courier won't be able to damage your pad. The cardboard is thick and has very little flex. There's also a very generous amount of packing film on the inside to prevent chipping. An extreme amount of care was taken to make sure that your pad will last forever. This next level durability is what makes the high price tag of the Skypad worth it in my opinion. Of course $100 will always be a lot for a pad because after all it is just a mouse pad. But the infinite durability that only a glass pad can give you just brings a rare peace of mind. When you buy a Skypad you absolutely never have to worry about it. It'll always stay in extremely high quality and won't ever break down. Replacing your pads after use, spills, or other accidents is just a non-concern. If this ends up being your main, this will be the last $100 you'll ever spend. No other pad can offer you that same value proposition, or give you 100% confidence in its extreme durability. Instead of a rubber backing across the entire underside, the Skypad uses 4 thick silicone feet in each corner to prevent it from slipping on your desk. The silicone is very sticky and, when combined with the high weight that I was talking about earlier, completely prevents the pad from moving at all. This is absolutely one of the best non-slip solutions, and I can completely shake my desk before I'm ever going to move the pad. I also think that this is one of the only bases that is completely desk independent. Most rubber backings will vary in performance whether you're using a wooden desk, a composite, or anything else. Sometimes rubber backing will just be incompatible with whatever you use, and there's nothing you can really do about that. But the Skypad, on the other hand, the silicone is so sticky and the pad is so heavy that I don't think you'll have any issues no matter what you use. This pad feels so stable. However, because these feet are so thick, it does make the pad sit very high for desk at about 4mm. I personally don't have any issues with this because I am able to bring the surface very close to the edge of my desk. Therefore, I don't notice the height difference much at all. But this may be a much larger issue for some because of how shallow this pad is. It is only 37 centimeters in this direction, so many people will have to push their pad further up the desk in order to get the proper vertical space they need. In this configuration, you can very easily feel the edge of the pad digging into your arm due to how much higher it sits from the surface. Now, I don't think the actual edge is an issue because it is rounded and feels quite pleasant. But the surface is so hard, so unforgiving, and sits so high up on your desk that it's just impossible to not notice. I think many people will have an issue with this edge digging into their arm, especially during vertical movements. However, this is still a fixable issue. You can simply just carefully remove the silicone feet and replace them with something much thinner like a drawer liner. This should deliver very similar non-slip results, but in a much more low-profile package. As long as you're willing to put in a little bit of effort, I think this issue is completely fixable. But once again, I have no issues with how I use the pad. If you can deal with only 38 centimeters of vertical space, I don't think you'll have any issues whatsoever. One other weird thing about the surface that I just want to quickly touch on is how vibrations very easily reverberate across the entirety of the pad. Any sort of shock you put in the pad gets distributed across the entirety of the surface and overall gives it a dampened effect. This helps improve the feeling of resetting your mouse greatly. instead of feeling like you're smashing your mouse feet into a rock every time you pick it up and put it down again. The effect gets dampened and a lot of the force gets distributed into the pad instead of back into your hand. Resetting my mouse feels much more pleasant than I thought it would be on a glass surface. Of course, it is still less comfortable than cloth, but it was really far better than what I was expecting. If you're worried about it feeling like you're just smashing your mouse down, then I don't think you should be concerned. It's not that bad at all. The added reverberation of the glass also just makes your clicks feel ever so slightly more crispy in my opinion. I feel like this effect is the most noticeable in the M2K, with Japanese arm-ons and a carbon fiber shell. When I click, I can just ever so slightly feel the clicks going through the pad, up, around, and back into my hand. This is super minor, of course, but if you have a very clicky switch, you will notice a slight difference. Alright, now on the surface feel, or how this actually feels in game. So, first things first, this is of course a speed pad. This will feel much faster than all cloth pads and most hybrid surfaces as well. Dynamic movements still have just a little bit of friction though. During large movements you do feel a noticeable amount of friction, but the glide still remains very quick overall. If you're looking for an absolute speed demon, the fastest pad you can possibly get, then I don't think this is quite what you're looking for. You can certainly have a pad that glides much faster, but this pad is still fast compared to the vast majority of options out there. The thing that really defines this glide experience for me is that it is buttery smooth. As I said before, the bumps on the frosted surface are very small. I don't feel them contributing to make any sort of roughness in the surface whatsoever. The texture completely gets out of your way and the pad feels extremely smooth on these motions. This glide is really very satisfying. Having a glide that is fast, slightly textured, and also buttery smooth is just an excellent combo. This ticks all the boxes for me for having a pad that just feels good to move your mouse across. This pad also has zero initial or static friction, and when I say zero, I mean zero. This pad easily requires the least amount of force to create mouse movement out of anything I've ever used. It's not even close. It feels like your mouse is floating across the pad for these small movements. It's almost as if it's hovering across the tiny little bumps in the texture. This type of floating feeling makes all motions feel completely effortless. It is so easy to get your mouse moving that it feels like it just happens instantly. There's no wind-up, no delay. It's just force applied from your hand directly into mouse movement. A completely effortless experience. This makes it so that every single motion your hand makes is perfectly translated into mouse movement. The vast majority of pads have some sort of resistance to them on these small movements. Therefore, some of the force applied from your hand into the mouse gets completely lost just trying to overcome the friction and get the mouse moving. But with Skypad, it feels like none of this force is lost. This is a very special experience that is completely unique to the Skypad. The best way that I can try to explain this to someone that hasn't tried the Skypad yet is to have them float their mouse above the surface without actually contacting the pad. Hovering your mouse a couple millimeters off the pad and moving it around generally gives a very similar experience to the Skypad itself. The only real difference is the lack of texture that I would otherwise experience on the Skypad. Closest thing you can get to feeling like you're not using a pad at all during these small motions. This feeling of very floaty effortlessness gives the Skypad a true feeling of one-to-one input. Everything my brain tells my hand to do gets perfectly turned into in-game camera motion through my mouse. I have never experienced such an effortless transferal of what I want to do into action. I can so easily translate the exact type of aim I want to do into the perfect mouse movement. This feeling of one-to-one hand-to-mouse movement is the #1 reason to get a Skypad. I feel like this will take your mouse control to the next level by removing all barriers that stand in your way. It feels like no motions whatsoever get lost on this pad, and your mouse control becomes the purest it can possibly be. Nothing else feels as effortless to aim on than this surface, and nothing else allows your mouse control to be as pure either. The texture on the surface also does a great deal to improve its performance. I absolutely think that textured pads are just better than smooth ones. If you haven't tried a textured surface, you absolutely need to. I don't think you can go back. On this pad specifically, I feel that the feedback makes it much easier to keep track of how I moved my mouse. For example, I can judge speed by how the texture feels on my mouse feet. I can very easily feel the difference between swiping the mouse quickly and then moving it slowly. The slower you go, the much more granular the surface feels, and it is very easy to tell. You can also more easily judge distance by the amount of tactility you get. You could very easily feel your entire mouse and arm swipe across the surface when you get so much feedback during the entire arc. After a while using the pad and really starting to get used to it, I almost start to get a feeling that you can start to estimate the amount of bumps you've crossed over when you're making these large swipes. Generally, 180 and 90 degree motions feel much more precise on textured surfaces. I feel that I'm able to physically feel how far I'm traveling, rather than just seeing my rotation on the screen and using my muscle memory to judge. Also, when you're making these small motions that the Skypad is so good at, you can feel the individual bumps. And because the bumps are so close together, it actually occurs at less than a pixel of distance. You can be so precise when you can feel each individual grains in these tiny motions. All this extra feedback you feel from a textured surface really helps improve the feeling of one-to-one experience that I talked about earlier. Since every single hand motion gets perfectly translated into mouse movement, some of the movements that you make are going to be accidental. That's just how humans work. We all make mistakes. The texture on the Skypad helps you not only see these mistakes on your screen, but actually feel them through your hand as you're making them. I feel like every motion is accounted for due to the texture. You can very easily inventory what you're actually doing with the mouse and where your mistakes are. This feels so good because you actually have to know where you messed up if you ever want to be able to improve. If you're making mistakes and you don't even notice, how can you ever address them? This texture makes it so much easier to very finely pinpoint your errors. because now instead of just seeing that you're jittery on the screen, you could actually feel that you're jittery through the texture and how inconsistent it feels. I feel that this frosted texture also gives the pad a very unique type of stopping power. When we talk about stopping power as it relates to slow control pads, like the very used, extremely slow GSR that I have here, we are generally talking about the feeling where if you move your mouse across a surface in a large motion, then at the very end you stop applying the force to your mouse, you'll feel the pad itself applying some force in the opposite direction and helping you stop the mouse for you. This is why it's called stopping power. The pad itself is applying additional power or force in the opposite direction that you're moving it, to help you come to a very fast and very stable stop. The Skypad, on the other hand, doesn't have this feeling where it helps you slow down at the end of a movement. If you stop applying force, the mouse just kind of keeps going, as opposed to the GSR, where it just does all the work for you. Instead, the texture on the Skypad only kicks in the stopping power at the very end of a motion. You can kind of see this in the glide test, where the pad moves very quickly and easily, but then at the very end, it'll very abruptly come to a stop. Here it is again. It's this very quick and very sure stop at the very end that is very important here. If you can manually slow your mouse down at the very end of a flick, you can very much so capture that feeling at the very end of a glide test where it very quickly comes to a stop. But you yourself have to counteract your mouse movement in order to get it to that point. But once you're then, it doesn't feel squirrely at all and has a very stable stop. Once you get it to stay still and you have manually brought it there, it certainly feels like it gets locked in place very quickly. It's almost like you're skipping everything at the middle and just capturing that feeling at the very end. This locked in feeling you get at the very end of a flick is it helps give it some stability without adding any sort of static friction. Control pads feel locked in by gluing your mouse to the surface whenever you stop it. When you require a lot of force to get your mouse moving from a static position, it ends up eliminating a lot of jitter or inconsistencies you may have. Like I said earlier, static friction ends up cleaning some of your movements out, and not every bit of force you apply to the mouse ends up moving it. This also gives a very strong feeling of deliberacy to your corrections. Because it requires so much force to get the mouse moving, you have to be sure that the very small corrections you make are on point, which can help slow your aim down and improve consistency for some. The Skypad can create a very similar feeling of stability, but it doesn't help you eliminate any sort of jitters or unwanted movements along the way. Only the very exact end of a flick feels locked in. If you can be very sure-footed after a fast movement and completely eliminate all jitters at the end, you can genuinely emulate the feeling of a slower control pad. It's almost as if you're able to piggyback off of that initial locked-in feeling you get, but only if you're able to eliminate all jitters yourself. Then you also need to be much more careful with your micro-corrections. Because despite it feeling locked in at first, any sort of motion you apply even just a millisecond after the fact will instantly move the mouse. This makes the Skypad style of stopping power feel extremely difficult, but also very rewarding. You can feel as locked in as a control pad, but only if you're able to do all the work in stopping your mouse yourself, and you're able to completely eliminate all jitters and accidental movements. It certainly demands a very high amount of you, much more than almost any other pad. But once you're able to learn it, it feels so satisfying and extremely rewarding. Alright, now onto the absolute best thing about the Surface, even better than anything I've described up until this point. And that is that this pad is unimaginably consistent. Of course, it is unaffected by all outside weather conditions. After all, there are no fibers to actually soak up the water, it's just a sheet of glass. Of course, scientifically, humidity will still affect surface friction, but that's so minor you're only going to notice it if you're just schizo beyond belief. For all practical definitions, this is absolutely humidity and weatherproof. Also, the glide itself feels extremely consistent during all types of use and is highly uniform. Every single area on the pad feels exactly the same, and due to it being glass, that's never going to change. It's also not pressure sensitive at all. Whether you push hard or light, the amount of dynamic friction feels exactly the same. And there are also no weird quirks or eccentricities to the surface. For example, a lot of control pads feel very slow on small movements, but will tend to seem faster when you start making larger ones across the surface. Other pads may have a strange amount of stopping power for the glide, or even the inverse where a slow pad will have high stopping power. But the Skypad's ratio of these properties just makes sense, it just feels very natural and even. Also, some surfaces may have different XY variations, or any number of other weird quirks that the Skypad just simply does not have. Seriously, the glide properties of this pad are extremely flat and just perfectly balanced. Everything just simply feels as it should be. Something about how the surface feels just works. This type of consistency is generally something that is very hard to explain to somebody that has not tried this pad yet. Glass is so much unlike anything else available that I don't think there's any other point of reference that could be useful. I think the best way to explain surface consistency is to actually explain my experience switching from the Skypad back to other cloth pads. Whenever I use a glass surface for about a week or so, and then I move back to a cloth or hybrid one, even something that I really like and feels extremely consistent, it just doesn't hit the same as it once did. All these pads over here just feel off somehow after using glass. I find myself starting to notice things that I just didn't before. There are always little things that just shouldn't be. Tiny little inconsistencies, tiny quirks, all of which you have just never noticed before. This makes these cloth and hybrid surfaces feel so alien after you've got used to glass. They're genuinely not the pads that you remember. This is why the phrase, once you go glass, you don't go back, will ring true for so many people. It isn't the case for me, and I am still very much able to enjoy cloth pads. After I spent the day getting used to them, of course. But some people can genuinely be ruined by the consistency that glass provides. It is unlike anything else. High quality cloth pads are still consistent enough. But glass, however, is perfect. And it will completely recontextualize how you feel about surface consistency in general. Alright, now onto the performance of the surface. As I said before, this is my personal highest performer. This is what I aim the best on. I by far have the best peaks on this pad. When you're on point with a speed surface, nothing else can compare. And I even have higher averages overall. My baseline level of play, what I can most consistently do, is better on this than anything I've ever tried. However, this still doesn't tell the full story. I think the best way to describe my full range of performance on the Skypad is with this pencil here. The tip represents my absolute peaks, where I am at my best. And then the eraser over here is my absolute chokes, where I am at my worst. You can imagine a natural distribution curve occurring across this pencil, with my average performance right in the middle here. Now for context, I'll place my current performance on my main pad, the XTEN Control. With the XTEN Control, I'd say that I perform within this window compared to the Skypad, with the same natural distribution curve occurring. You can clearly see that I have much higher peaks, and even my average is just a little bit better than the XTEN. However, the biggest difference by far is the much greater variance I have with the Skypad. And of course, how much lower my lows are. This makes using the Skypad feel like I'm rolling the dice sometimes. My variance is so much greater than it is on control pads that it's hard to get very consistent results. I feel that this is really just a natural consequence of speed pads. They completely get out of your way and help you to perform at your best. You simply cannot move your mouse as quickly and as accurately as you can on a control pad. But on the other hand, they don't help you out when you're at your worst. When you're absolutely choking, they aren't there to smooth out your aim or help you with stopping at all. It really feels like speed pads hang you out to dry and expose the true variation in your performance, peaks and valleys and all. You can also see this variance in pros when they play on glass. The Overwatch player Pine, who played on Season 1 NYXL for example, plays on what is essentially the Korean version of the Skypad. He was known for having some of the most insane clips you've ever seen, and even after the game developing for a couple of years, I haven't seen anybody able to replicate the clips he's gotten. But even though Pine got these crazy peaks, he was also known for completely choking sometimes. He would either flank the enemy team, kill everybody, or hard whiff and just feed his brains out. You can very clearly see he didn't have that level of consistency, but his peaks were undeniably high. And then the counterexample from the same game, Overwatch, would of course be Ons from Season 3 Shock. He played on a GSR like I had earlier, that he sanded down to make even more rough and slow. Then he even removed his mouse feet and completely sanded down the plastic flat. So he literally used an even slower GSR with custom-made control mouse feet. I literally don't think you can get more friction than his setup provided. And his play was shockingly consistent. He was a genuine robot that just never missed. He didn't do anything flashy like Pine, and he never quite reached the same peaks. But the amount of value he was able to bring for his team was much higher, because he was always the most reliable player in the server. Now, of course, this observation isn't scientific. I only have 2 data points as anecdotal evidence. Season 3 versus Season 1 OWL are just completely different games, and NYXL and Shock had polar opposite styles, so they thus require their hit scans to do opposite things. But I still do think this example does a good job of trying to illustrate what I'm talking about. That speed has very high peaks and very high variance, but control is extremely consistent, and this could even apply to the professional level, with the absolute best players that should be able to control speed pads. Alright, so now back to me personally. I also feel that this higher consistency of control pads makes it easier to improve all aspects of my game. Replicatable results make it much easier to see what's wrong. Think about this as precision versus accuracy. If you're getting very similar results but they're still wrong, you could very easily tune your instrument and make these very consistent results the correct ones. But if you have an instrument with a very high variance, but that is ultimately closer to the actual correct value, it is still worse, because it'll be much less reliable and impossible to tune. I also feel that I can much easier focus on other aspects of improvement when my aim isn't the actual issue. I'm so inconsistent that other parts of my game suffer on the Skypad. Sometimes I put myself in a very poor situation, but I'm able to completely bail myself out because I'll perform really well on the Skypad. This can start to reinforce really bad habits because you're not actually learning anything, you're just outskilling people. And then on the other hand, sometimes I'll make the correct play, but then I'll choke my aim so hard that I'll get punished and lose out on that practice. This leaves a very sour taste in my mouth and is just overall tilting. This higher degree of consistency I also feel gives a better gauge of your actual skills. It eliminates a lot of the variables and helps you really figure out what your average is. This makes improvement feel a little bit more satisfying, because you can see much more incremental results that happen day by day. Whereas on speed pads, some days you play well, some days you're just trash, and that's how it goes. Now, this big lack of consistency that is just inherent to speed pads is one of the major things that holds this pad back for me, and dooms it to be stuck in the second place limbo forever. This is still clearly my best performer, but it still doesn't feel reliable enough for me to be my go-to surface. It will always be second place to a control pad that I can find to be much more consistent and reliable for my use. But at the same time, I don't see this pad ever getting lower than my number 2 either, because it is still so much fun to find my upper limits on the surface. Improvement is absolute crack for me. I love seeing numbers go higher and hitting better clips. It is so satisfying. And this pad helps me hit my absolute peaks, unlike anything else. It's not even close. And also, it is just fun to play mouse control roulette sometimes. Sometimes you just gotta say fuck it, full send, and to see if your aim can bail you out. Of course, it's not playing to win, and honestly, it's a hard throw most of the time. But when it works out, oh, it is so good. It is so crisp, so satisfying. This pad is crazy fun to use. I cannot overstate that. It is always a good experience when I pull it out. So now that I talked about my performance, now it's time to talk about yours. I 100% believe that this pad will make you a better aimer, because this hard forces good mouse control habits. The surface forces you to be completely manual and doesn't hold your hand whatsoever. This exposes all the flaws in your aim. And now, once you know the flaws that the Skypad exposes to you, it makes it so much easier to identify what you need to actually improve at. When you have a pad that helps you along, it can so easily cover up your flaws, but this just brings them all out into the light. And then, like I said, the texture on top of it makes it so much easier to identify these. You're not only going to see what you did wrong, but feel it. And of course, be advised, this will feel extremely daunting at first. Your aim will feel like absolute shit because of how clear all your flaws are. Nothing else will make you feel more trash at aiming than first switching to the Skypad, especially from a controlled surface. But this is still so consistent that it will feel learnable over time. You will eventually start to get a feel for how this pad behaves because of how uniform it is. Across every session, every time of day, it's always going to be exactly the same. And you're eventually going to start to learn the language that this surface speaks. And finally, once you start to learn it, it's going to feel so rewarding to get good with. You are going to experience very gradual improvement over time, as long as you keep putting in the work and specifically focusing on what you're doing wrong. If you continue to do this, you will eventually experience the very peaks of your aim for the first time. I cannot overstate how satisfying this is. You're going to have a very distinctive moment where you just hit something and think to yourself, I can't do that on any other surface. And once you experience this for the first time, once you have that breakthrough moment, it's going to be smooth sailing. You're going to feel very motivated, and these types of situations will just keep happening more and more. As long as you're able to put in the effort, your aim will improve on the surface. Just give it some time to learn. This pad is just so unique that unless you're just a hardcore speed pad enthusiast and have a lot of experience with using these types of surfaces, it will take you a while to learn. Alright, so now just onto the inherent downsides of this glass itself. The first and most glaring of which is that this is extremely high maintenance. That buttery smooth glide that I was talking about earlier only happens if the surface is completely clean. A single speck of dust, a single cat hair will completely ruin the glide. And this is not hyperbole, it is unusable if anything is on the surface. Now of course this is an issue if you can keep it clean, and like I said, it's buttery smooth. But no other pad forces you to clean it like you do on this. Even plastic surfaces that I've used in the past were not nearly as bad as glass. This ends up making the pad feel very distracting. After the first time you run over something and it just completely ruins the glide, you're going to start blaming the pad and just tilting. Then after your first very native experience with a piece of dust getting you killed in game, you're going to end up obsessively cleaning it off whenever you get the chance. This Skypad has this weird way of just digging itself into the back of my mind, this constant obsession with wiping down my mouse whenever I have a free time. In between lives, whenever I'm in the lobby, I just reflexively wipe down my mouse and my mouse feet. This type of obsession just sticks in my brain and ultimately ends up distracting me from what I'm doing, which is just playing the game. It is a genuine concern for me, and I do feel like it sometimes distracts me and impacts my play. But the even more pressing issue is when you have an issue with the actual mouse feed itself and not some grime on the pad. PTFE is pretty soft and can blemish quite easily. When you get one of these blemishes, it completely ruins the pad just like a piece of dust or hair. But unlike dust or hair, you can't wipe it off so easily. You need to very thoroughly scrub it with a more abrasive microfiber like I have here, or to scrape it against the pad until it eventually becomes smooth and consistent. For example, my GPX ran into this issue where this very large top skate got scratched. For a few days, it was completely unusable on the Skypad. While I was watching videos or just doing other things on my computer, I had to sit there and just constantly scrape it up against the pad for hours. Eventually, it was able to get better, and now it feels perfectly smooth. But for a while, I could not use it because it felt so horrendous. So now that we're on the topic of mouse feet, I just want to say that this doesn't wear down feet as fast as you think it does. The sound is, of course, very loud, so it does seem like it should just shred your feet, but I haven't had much issues with excessive feet wear personally, and I have seen other people say the same. It will, of course, wear them down faster than cloth, but it's not deal-breaking. Now the next major issue is that sweat buildup on your arm, along with the humidity in your room, makes this pad extremely sticky on your skin. Of course, you can completely eliminate this issue with a sports sleeve, and I will use one when it starts to get sticky. But this surface feels so good on my arm that I feel like it's just sacrilege to use a sleeve with it. Of course, this will be personal preference, and some people will swear by 100% sleeve usage, but I just like this arm feel so much that I just never want to compromise it. I love the extra tactility that I get from my arm, and I just feel so much more in tune when I'm not using a sleeve. But what I think is the even bigger issue about this is that it just adds another layer of tilt. Weather conditions are something that are just so entirely out of your control that it sucks to feel like something like that can force you to use a pad in a way that you don't like. And also, depending on how you grip a mouse, a sleeve may not actually work for you. If you really dig your fingers into the pad, then you may actually notice the tips of your fingers sticking to the surface just as much as your arm. This cannot be fixed by a sleeve, and will be a genuine deal breaker for some. So the sticky arm feel plus the obsessive cleaning I tend to do both contribute to me not completely focusing on the game that I'm playing. I find myself actively thinking about the pad I'm using instead of focusing. I think in general, the best rule of thumb for peripherals is that what you don't notice you're using is what's best for you. When you just never have to think about your pad or your mouse, I believe that you're able to play at your fullest. Of course, you may not aim as well, but FPS games are about so much more than aim, and there are many more factors that go into actually playing at your best. So this distracting nature of the pad, combined with the general inconsistencies I get from the SpeedPad, are what hold this back from being my number one pad. Alright, so now on to some conclusions and just like a TLDR section, because this recording is going an extremely long time. Alright, so this pad, the Skypad, is absolutely insane. It's perfect quality, it completely redefines what consistency of a surface means, and it is also what I aim the best with. But most importantly, it's just a very fun pad that I love to use. I also think that it's just the highest performing surface available. As long as you're able to put in the time and effort into learning this, I think that you will be able to perform at your absolute peaks on this over any other pad. However, this still just has a very large asterisk attached to it that I just cannot not address. A glass surface to me is very annoying to use. This is the only pad I've ever used that has genuinely tilted me before. The absolute tiniest thing on surface can completely ruin the glide, and your arm sticking is extremely annoying. My aim is also inherently less consistent due to it being a speed pad. Of course, speed pad maniacs won't find this to be a problem, but I myself generally prefer medium speed control pads. But despite these two flaws, this absolutely still gets my highest recommendation. Anybody who's looking for a speed pad or is willing to learn one, this should be the only thing you consider. I don't think anything else currently comes close to this or ever will. It is simply the best option for what it provides. Alright, thank you all for watching. See you in the next one.